Hello and welcome to part 3 of this series, New York and the Hermetic Code. I'll put the links in the description to parts 1 and 2, but before we begin, have a look at, what is the Hermetic Code? What are the themes? Well, geometry. The sundial represents, the compass and the clock, so we have time and direction. Weights and measures will also be a theme, as well as the occult, such as Freemasonry and, again, not exclusively Freemasonry. I'm just using these as a jumping off point because this is the most accessible, most well known. Rosicrucians, Theosophy, the Druids, the Buffaloes, and so many other organisations have these same themes running through their artwork. So not just in the modern period, going way back through time. And those themes are sun, earth, moon, and stars, such as represented in the Quadrivium, Astronomy, Geometry, Music, and Arithmetic. And so, especially the symbols of sun and moon, or the planets, as we see here, again, cross time. They go back not just centuries, but thousands of years. And these are the themes which are written into the architecture. Now, there might be argued certain buildings that the architect did it without their knowledge, that they chose certain measurements because of for historical reasons. They'll basically, to say it impolitely, sort of copy pasting other elements. But even though the architect may not have done it knowingly, the point is that it's still being done, and that there is a traceable tradition of this going back to people who were involved in it and certainly did understand the principles of as above, so below, the Hermetic Code. And so to begin, we see New York, Manhattan will be the focus, and in part 2 especially, I went through some of the elements regarding Grand Central Terminal and also the Manhattan Bridge. Now part 2 was more in regards to the symbolic, mythological aspects of it, but for instance, Grand Central Terminal, the main concourse, 120 feet wide. Manhattan Bridge, 120 feet wide. Both of them contain statues of Hermes or Mercury, but both of them are also related to transport, and these are sort of themes. So again, across post office, train stations across the world, you'll find these same themes running. But to begin with, 120 feet. Why was this chosen? What does it mean? In earlier videos I've mentioned it, but we'll have a look. And what's really happening is it's sun, earth, moon, and stars. Now, this is not the only aspect of it, but it is one which is more, more easily grasped. Now, so we see the measures 120 feet. Well, links us to 12 constellations in the zodiac precession, 12 months in the year. In the vesica, 12 inches per foot, and even 12 is like continues throughout history the importance of 12 people in organisations, juries, etc. 12 apostles at 360 hand, 360 degrees in the compass. When you break down minutes and hours, both on the clock and the compass, 3600. Mayan time count, 360 days, also defines a very nice description of the moon. Also, it's one of these beautiful numbers across dimensions, just like with 12, but also in triangular numbers, which connects to the Pythagorean Tetractys. You'll also see it so important in geometry, the vesica, the golden ratio, the pentagon, pentagram, platonic solids such as the icosahedron, 360 degrees in the compass describes a circle, but also any four-sided object will be 360 degrees, squares or rectangles. At 480 palm, we're a troy ounce, where we measure gold and silver, precious metals, 480 grains. Nice link to the year of the Brahma, but also a continuing theme throughout all of this is New Jerusalem. And New Jerusalem itself is a later retelling of the Ark of Utnapishtim, and the Great Flood as described in Sumerian Babylonian tradition. At 1440 inches, 144 is so much like geometry, Rosicrucian, music, and alchemy. The golden ratio, beautiful number across dimensions. So much in regards to that sun and moon. 1440 minutes per day. Sun, Earth and Moon through that method, ancient weights and measures, modern weights and measures, screen resolution, Mayan calendar, even the Yuga, Satya Yuga, is broken down into the beginning, the middle, and the end, 144, and of course in geometry, hexagons, the vesica, even the nonagon, which is a recurring theme. I'm starting to add that a little bit more. But also New Jerusalem, so the area, the height of the walls, even 12 tribes with 12,000 each, 1440. Also in the Epic of Gilgamesh, now at 4,320 or 432. Again, weights and measures, music scales, the yugas, cycles of time and destruction as described in Eastern traditions. The Vesica, the New Jerusalem, the Ark of Utnapishtim, as well as the moon. Again, it's one of these numbers that's loaded with information. But also, so at 1,920 or 192 and 432, we also have a nice connection to hertz, and hertz are measured by meters, and the meter is an ancient unit. Metric is ancient. That needs to be grasped, and eventually they'll have to catch on to that. But also it's a conversion point, so the Doric, the Ionic and Corinthian, which are strong Masonic symbols, so it's 1,800 Doric fingers. Any triangle is 180 degrees, again the vesica, but also the moon. So you have again this number which has more than a few aspects to it, and sun, earth, moon, geometry, arithmetic and music throughout this whole series. But it's also a beautiful conversion point to the Royal Babylonian ancient scale of measure. Now it's not a whole number there, but that's still, because this will connect to the Great Pyramid. So for instance, the 1411 11 to 7 ratio gives us not only the golden number, but also 1.2727, or as we see, the height versus the half base will give us the 272727, which is also a lovely description of the proportion of the Earth and the Moon to one another, plus the golden ratio, plus the angle which it creates is connected to the golden ratio. It's just full of information. But back to 1440, well, as best count, we cannot really be sure, but there are 144 casing stones, which is another lovely connection to New Jerusalem and these older traditions. But now, so these are Grand Central Terminal, Manhattan Bridge. Maybe you could describe it as a previous, the superstition of a previous time. But the Bank of America Tower, One Bryant Park, 1,200 feet. So just 120 feet times 10. Therefore, its height, total height, including the spire, has all of this same information embedded in it. But the building itself to the roof is 945 feet. I'm just going to touch on that for the moment. We'll come back to this because all these will connect very strongly with so many structures across Manhattan and the world, modern world, ancient world. But for instance, we come back to the Pentagon, the maximum visible base length of the pyramid, which itself will convert to E-1 on the Babylonian scale. We also get the radius of the moon and the sun on the Egyptian Royal Mile. Now another way to look at the Royal Mile is the Royal Mile in Scotland, in Edinburgh, which is another place full of this tradition and this history. But 945 is also a beautiful number in regards to the orbit of the Earth around the Sun. So we have 94.5 million miles at aphelion, July 4th. The Declaration of Independence was declared, but exactly signed a few days earlier. They delayed it, I'm sure, to have this connection, Sun, Earth and Moon through 945. But we also, its conversion point on Doric and Ionic, 2935125. You'll see that same on the Manhattan Bridge. You'll find it on the Trinity Church in New York. You'll also see it on the New York Times building in New York. Also, there are some other examples, again, across New York, but also across the world. And this number in itself is a very powerful number in regards to the relationship of Sun, Earth and Moon, this continuing theme. And well, that's got to do with the full moon or the synodic month. Now, what's a synodic month? That's where we basically get our calendar month, and what it is one orbit of the moon around the Earth in relation to the sun. So an alignment of sun, Earth, and moon. This is what causes the eclipse. This is where we get full moons, that type of, so the lunar calendar, crop cycles, everything's connected to this. But 2935125 or 29.53125 days will be included because of the elliptical orbit. But why is that important? Well, if we multiply the diameter of the Earth times the number of days per synodic month, we get the distance from the Earth to the moon. Very powerful connection at the end. So natural scales of distance and natural scales of time through this number 29.53. Now 125 would also be included in this because of again, elliptical orbits, different distances, and also the length of time, sort of a slight variation. So you're not rounding it off. There are periods, there is this is 100% true at times, but again, it's a bit like a wave. It moves back and forth, but it is an excellent connection to sun, Earth, moon, and the stars, as we'll see more and more. So this is the Hermetic code. This is why groups such as the Freemasons carry this through, and architects such as Cass Gilbert. Now he's very, very important in American architectural history because, for instance, the US Supreme Court building was designed by him. In New York, the Thurgood Marshall Courthouse was designed by him, and we'll look at all these things more and more. But in the previous episode, I touched on especially the symbolism in the West Virginia State Capitol building in Charleston, which was also designed by him. But back to New York, and we have the Woolworth Building, which again, it's an iconic, it's a landmark building. I'm not just grabbing some random building or some tin shed somewhere and finding these are iconic structures, and that they are embedded with this system. Again, as I've covered in so many other videos across Australia, across the rest of the world, it is part of a method. Now, Cass Gilbert designed this. Now, out of interest, the Alchemy Properties Group is the current owner of this, and we see the the most recent, logo and the older logo, which in itself contains subtle information there for those of you into your symbolism. So the Woolworth Building, and here we see the measures in SI, or international standard, the common foot that most of us would be familiar with. But this building and those numbers connect back to part one, where I went through the Statue of Liberty, designed by the Freemason Frederick August Bartholdi, and the measures themselves. So these will join back, and this is again, the Statue of Liberty is another temple of sun, earth, moon, and stars, as best understood through the Quadrivium, Astronomy, Music, Geometry, and Arithmetic. And this will also connect us back through to the Bank of America building, Manhattan Bridge, and Grand Central Terminal. And so I could do a lot. I will be following through this a lot more and showing how all of these buildings interconnect with one another, because if I do them individually, it's sort of the numbers can get lost. So I'm going to change the strategy a little bit, and I'll blend them all together. But just to go through, as an example, the Woolworth Building, already mentioned the importance of 12 and weights and measures, the calendar, precession, lovely number across dimensions connected to weights and measures. Well, for instance, as in part one I showed, that's also in the Statue of Liberty. That number is also shown in the Manhattan Bridge, the Bank of America building, and Grand Central Terminal at 48. Mentioned the year of the Brahma at grams. I keep saying the metric connects to the imperial, and the ounce we measure gold and silver, for example, and that of course is also reflected in the Statue of Liberty building, Statue of Liberty and the base, for instance. Now at 132, which is also converts to 132 at ionic fingers, 13,200, which is the length of 13,200 feet, is the length of Central Park, the Earth, scales of measure for fish, interestingly, and once more the nonagon, how this connects at 220. So many other, we'll draw some more lines through there as well. For instance, Hellgate Bridge, which is basically a replica of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which in part one I showed is connections to the Statue of Liberty. 264, multiple scales of measure, the Earth, but also brings us to the Sun. 528 cubits, the Earth, New Jerusalem. The Solfeggio, weights and measures, pi, phi, and E is like a nice connection there, but also the 32nd triangular number is 528, 32 rods is 528 feet, 33 pounds is 528 ounces, 32 and 33. And of course that's also reflected in the description in the base of the Statue of Liberty. 792 is probably the most beautiful harmony point, because it describes the speed of the solar system around the galactic core, Sun, Earth, Moon, and New Jerusalem, and the Gunter's chain of 66 feet or 792 inches. Now, for instance, the Washington Memorial Arch in New York is 77 feet or 792 Cremona inches, but also, though, at 1,056 feet, that's the conversion point between feet and the long foot, but it's also the number of cubits, so of describing the maximum visible base of New Jerusalem as well. But now now I mentioned Doric and Ionic. Now they're described. You can, for instance, a Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian column in a tracing board, Sun, Earth, Moon, and stars, and all these other symbols connected to construction, architecture, also arithmetic, and so many other things, including the bells, for instance. But so the Doric column, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. Well, again, so older boards, we see this in new boards. You'll find it in architecture. So important buildings will tend to have a Doric, Ionic, and then Corinthian capital on top. But credit to Mark Wilson Jones, he deciphered the Salamis stone, and showed that it's not really too much, but it's a conversion tool between multiple sets of measure. And for instance, the Parthenon, the columns are 48 feet high, or 45 Doric or 50 Ionic, but also the Salamis stone shows that the supposedly modern foot is actually much older than what we think. So we have this ratio as well, 48, 45, 50. Well, that's also expressed in the Woolworth Building, 48 rods or 45 Doric or 50 Ionic, and this will be a continuing. But these are not just scales of measure as by the ruler, but they're also connected to musical scales, so the modes of music, Dorian and Ionian, or Doric and Ionic. Kirchhoff, very famous, very important figure to follow in regards to this. And so we're seeing measurements of length, but also measurements of music as well, amongst other things. But also, so we see how these form conversion points where we have whole numbers. So they've chosen a very specific number to make this building, and this building will also link it to, for instance, 33 and other. But it's also a conversion point on the long scale, so we have multiple sets of measures coming together at whole numbers, and very beautiful numbers in those terms. Also, it's a conversion for the Mohenjo-Daro foot, or Harappa, the ancient Indus, a very ancient unit of measure. We're talking over 4,500 years in regards to this, or at least 4,000, probably older. But also the Royal Babylonian scale, once more, not only in whole numbers, but very beautiful whole numbers, and we'll have more of a look at those now. Well, to begin with, 18,000. Well, again, I mentioned 18 earlier, the descriptions of the moon on the Ionic and the long scale, which of course is described in this structure. Also the vesica, which forms the basis of this geometry, but also at 600, so 6, beautiful, perfect number, the most perfect 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6, 1 times 2 times 3 equals 6. That's the only number that has that property. 60 minutes, 60 seconds, both on the clock and the compass. On the direct scale on fingers, 11,880. Well, Earth and Moon being described by this Ionic and the long scale as. But for instance, 720 on the Mohenjo-Daro or the Harappa scale, 72 years per degree of precession, which will link the Earth to the stars through the Sun, the equinox. But also we have the Moon, but also the same numbers, very powerful in regards to geometry, the vesica, the hexagon, tetrahedron, a platonic solid, also in the pentagon, pentagram, and links us to Phi. Also through modern weights and measures, the most modern computer, 720p screen resolution, ancient Greco-Roman measures, even the not quite ancient, but the older thermometer scales, but also cycles of time, for instance, the Mayan calendar, and also back to the yugas, where we see that the Para Yuga 864 breaks down into units of 72. Very interesting as well. So like the heartbeat at resting, 72 beats per minute. 72% of the human body is water, while in ancient legends, for instance in Egyptian, Osiris was murdered by Set, and he had 72 accomplices, so 73 in total as well is a nice connection. But also Thoth, or Hermes, or Mercury. Thoth is the Hermetic code. He wants it, and is also a moon god, so he wants 72 days for the moon, while in China, in the martial arts, Confucius, and Chinese literature traditions, 72 being very important, but also in Western mysticism, 72 names of God. That's a picture by Kershaw. Solomon, 72 demons. Jesus, 72 disciples, and it really carries on throughout this. So this is just the Woolworth Building. We'll do more links, and because I want to connect, rather than just go through each building individually, show how each number will connect to multiple buildings across New York, and not just the older New York, but also the most modern of the New York skyscrapers. There's another aspect of the Hermetic principle, as above, so below, that in previous videos I've touched on. I made one video about it, and I'll put the link in the description because of the geometry of the vesica, which leads to the hexagon, so or the equilateral triangle, then the hexagon, 12-pointed star, 24-pointed star, which connects to time, and so many other things. Well, that's based on something called Bode's law. Well, Bode's law connects very well to it now. For quite some time it's been on the fringe, but in recent years, especially in the hunt for exoplanets, Bode's law has started to take, grab hold of, to be looked at in a relooking at it in a more open way. But for instance, it's a system of geometry. So Mercury, we begin with 0 plus 4 over 10, and that gives us the distance in AU. Now 1 AU is an astronomical unit, or the average distance from the Sun to the Earth. Why average distance to the Sun to the Earth? Well, under Bode's law, Earth is at 1, so it is the unity point in this particular system. So that gives it some value in that way. But so we begin with 0, and then we have a 3-pointed star, then a 12-pointed star, then a 24-pointed star, always plus 4 over 10. And Bode's law actually predicted Ceres and the asteroid belt. So not only did it describe what was already there, but it actually predicted what would be found in the future, which makes it a powerful something really worth looking at. And Saturn becomes 10, so that's an interesting point as well. But so Bode's law, now you may have noticed here in these cards that there are 2 planets which do not fit Bode's law perfectly, and they are Venus and, as we see here, Neptune. Now there are interesting points in regarding Venus and Neptune, which go a good way to explaining why they would not fit. And now, for instance, Venus is the only planet which rotates in the opposite direction to the Earth. All planets, just like the Earth, orbit rotate in one direction, except for Venus. One of the reasons could be an impact, something like that, in the past. While Neptune is the Pluto crosses in front of Neptune, or comes closer to the Earth. So Neptune, you could say is effectively in the Kuiper belt. So there are two reasons to consider that. But Bode's law emerges from the vesica, seed of life, flower of life. Now, back to the Woolworth Building, because within the dimensions of the Woolworth Building, we will see many of it, like Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and Venus. They are also covered in this system, which also describe, well, Sun, Earth, Moon, stars, for instance. And there we see the numbers which join them. Now, this will cross over to many other buildings. Now we'll have a look at Napoleon Lebrun, or Lebrun, I'm not sure exact pronunciation. Another one of these very important architects in regards to New York history. He designed the first Masonic Manhattan Temple. Now you might notice there's no record of him being a Mason, and this is an interesting point in regards to architects who design Masonic temples are not Masons, which sort of seems to be an underlying theme, at least Scottish Rite cathedrals, these type of things. But in part one, Metropolitan Life Tower and the North Tower, I incorrectly said that Cass Gilbert was the architect, but Cass Gilbert did do the Woolworth Building, but he did not do the Metropolitan Life Tower. And so, as we already showed, but anyway, we have once more, so the system of Bode's law, how it is included in this architecture. While if you look at the Metropolitan Life Tower, the North Tower by Harvey Wiley Corbett, I've covered him in especially in part one, but the tower itself is based after the bell tower in Venice, as my old mullet, and it has so many other points which will connect, just like with all of these buildings I'm covering, these very important ones. Also, you'll find that Bode's law is also included in here, but as well as so many other, like the clock, the compass, sun, earth, moon, geometry, arithmetic. These are all very lovely numbers in regards to that. So this will be an underlying fact. Now I'm going to, in the next part, I'm going to focus. Typically, I do a building and then go through the numbers. But just to show the connections between these buildings and these architects in an upcoming episodes, I'm going to use the number and then connect it to all the buildings, because each one of these, including the modern skyscrapers, Manhattan Bridge, Grand Central Terminal, Statue of Liberty, World Trade Centers, the Twin Towers, and Trinity Church, and all these other cathedrals and stuff around New York have the same pattern going on, and yeah, so just to show how they're all joined, I'll do it in a different format in the upcoming video. But for instance, Metropolitan Life Tower, this has the same method going on, where you have these same lovely numbers which are joined through the Hermetic code, through the Quadrivium, Astronomy, Music, Arithmetic, and Geometry. And like for instance, 21,600 Cremona grain. There are 21,600 minutes in the compass. Equatorial diameter of the Earth, 21,600 nautical miles. It's the cube, 2,160, which is the miles of the moon. But they also have New Jerusalem and precession, for instance, 21,600 years per age. And also we have the polar circumference of the Earth as defined by Eratosthenes, and he used an obelisk which happened to be at a certain angle, which connects so beautifully to precession. For instance, 25,920 seconds, that's how many years in one great year. And also sort of, 112. Now, yeah, as I said, in the next episode, I'm going to list all the buildings, and then I'll go through the numbers one by one to show how they all have it in here. It's just on a shifted scale, and on so things like Cremona, Doric, Ionic, Longfoot, the Indus Valley measurements, the Royal Babylonian measurements, Egyptian royal measurements, how these actually all, there's a pattern going on, and there are the same numbers, the same proportions, sun, earth, moon, and stars. But yeah, so that'll be the feature of the next one. So again, sun, earth, moon, and stars, but also as sort of shown here in regards to Bode's law, how this same pattern of geometry and arithmetic also describes the astronomy of the planets, which you could also look at, like a bit like the harmony of the spheres, or there's like a musical sense to all of this. So you're covering again the quadrivium, music, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy, blend together so lovely with these allegedly modern systems of weight and measure, which connect so beautifully to ancient systems of weight and measure, which harmonize with sun, earth, moon, and stars. And so things like the eclipse, even the distances, even the distance of every aspect, sort of like it'd be easier to list the stuff which doesn't match up than to list the things that do, because they're endless. And but the symbolism of this, goes back not just to before the formal lodges, before the Rosicrucians. Really this Hermetic code goes back to ancient times, and the 7 liberal arts, especially the quadrivium, being key features. So with an understanding of geometry, there comes a connection to arithmetic. And from arithmetic, we can then use that to examine music. And from music, we can then look up, and we can examine astronomy. And that's the beauty of these systems. And that's one of the underlying points of as above, so below, and the quadrivium. If you are interested in music, you will accidentally learn about arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. If you're interested in astronomy, you're going to accidentally learn about arithmetic, music, and geometry, and vice versa. That is, at least for my mind, the most beautiful aspect of this, is that it's, instead of having separate disciplines the way we do now, you go to a music class and you go to a math class. Then you'll go to a science class and do astronomy, or even geometry will be separated from your typical math class in some curriculum, but yet they're all blended together, and that's what I think is one of the shames. And for instance, historically, in classical times, the quadrivium was the standard curricula. Now, there was a move away from that, and that was done basically with the emergence of the industrial age, where factory owners created a school system where we wanted people to be educated just enough to operate the machines and fill out the forms, but not enough to think. And this is why this system has fallen out of favour. And you can just see in new maths and all this stuff, it's divide, separate into different disciplines. But anyway, with that, I hope you enjoyed. In the upcoming episodes, I'm going to change the format a little bit so you can see how all the buildings come together and street plans rather than separate. But anyway, have a good one.